Again, welcome back from the break to all those attending the history session. Again, we thank the CMC for allowing us to have that break, and of course Leonardo for the rest of the session. We thank them for that. So the second part of our session will encompass three papers. The first of these papers will be delivered by Colonel retired John Orr. He comes to us from Canada. Again, another participant from our international community, which is welcome on our session anytime. So that's fantastic. Obviously, Colonel Orr is going to talk about the Sea King, which is a helicopter that has a special place in my heart since I flew that helicopter in the Navy, just like he did as an officer in the United States, in the Canadian Navy. So again, he's retired from the Royal Canadian Navy, and he joined that Navy in 1963. So he graduated in 1967 from the Royal Military College of Canada, and he was obviously assigned to many duties, as all naval officers are, and moving up through the chain of command and doing great things in Canada and outside Canada. He even participated in some of the United States and Canadian Navy activities by flying on aircraft carriers such as the USS Nimitz, etc. So Colonel Orr has an incredible experience on helicopter operations, especially the Sea King. So he's a person who is very well equipped to talk to us about this particular helicopter. I don't know much about his technical background as far as being an engineer and all that. However, I know that from the point of view of being an operator, which is a big part of helicopter design and operations, he definitely can talk to us about that. Obviously, now that he's retired, he devotes a lot of work to helicopter history, especially the Sea King history, and he's also done some editing work for the Canadian Naval Review. He's also a museum member of a museum in Canada, in Nova Scotia, the U.S. Naval Air Station Halifax, former U.S. Naval Air Station Halifax, which I think I encourage folks to visit if you like this kind of history. But without further ado, I would like to go ahead and sit down and shut up, as they say, and let Colonel Orr take it over from here. Thank you, sir.
Now, my topic today is the 55-year history of the Canadian Sea King helicopter. Obviously, the Sea King needs no introduction to this audience. However, as you'll see, its military service in Canada is different than that of its United States Navy counterpart. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge my personal debt to the Sikorsky archives, and in particular, Dan Libertino and Tom Lawrence, who personally guided me through the history of the evolution of the Sea King helicopter. In putting this presentation together, I came across the following quote from the 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. In keeping with this thought, we'll take a look back at the 55 years of the Canadian Sea King in order to understand the significance of its service to Canada and Canadians. To state the blindingly obvious, 55 years is quite a long time, especially in aviation terms. And yet, from 1963 until 2018, the Sea King was Canada's frontline maritime helicopter and saw yeoman service in the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Armed Forces, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Evidence that while the game remains the same, the uniforms can change. The history of the Canadian Sea King roughly breaks down into the periods shown here. I will concentrate on these three periods: procurement and fleet introduction, the first Gulf War and Somalia, and the year of 2010, which was an incredible year in the life of the Sea King. The first Canadian Sea King was accepted on the 24th of May, 1963, at the Sikorsky plant in Stratford, Connecticut, by Lieutenant Commander Shell Roll, the commanding officer of the Canadian Navy's Test and Evaluation Squadron, and Lieutenant Commander Ted Fallon, the commanding officer of the Navy's Operational Helicopter Squadron. No teenagers looked happier to get the keys to Daddy's car than these two gents. How and why this purchase came about is an important part of the Sea King story. First, the why. With the arrival of the nuclear-powered submarine, the balance between NATO's anti-submarine forces and the Soviet submarine fleet changed dramatically. The first nuclear-powered submarine, USS Nautilus, was commissioned by the United States Navy in 1954 and was soon followed by the arrival of the Soviet Navy's November and Hotel classes. With this revolution in naval affairs, the balance of anti-submarine warfare swung dramatically in favor of the submarine, some would say forever. For Canada, this presented a dilemma. A new class of destroyer escorts, the Saint Laurent class, shown here on the left, was introduced in 1955 and were almost immediately rendered obsolescent, if not obsolete, by the fast, deep-diving, nuclear-powered submarine. And so the decision was made to modify the Saint Laurents to accommodate an as yet undetermined anti-submarine warfare helicopter. A modified version of the Saint Laurent class is shown on the right. You can see that the after gun mount has been removed, the funnel uptake has been split, and a hangar and flight deck have been installed. This left the matter of the selection of a helicopter up in the air. Without going into the details, the competition eventually ended up between the Cayman Sea Sprite on the left and the Sikorsky Sea King on the right. Both helicopters were undergoing their US Navy acceptance at approximately the same time. The Sea Sprite was a new single-engine utility helicopter, and the Sea King was a new purpose-built twin-engine anti-submarine helicopter. From the Canadian Navy's perspective, the Sea Sprite was the preferred option for the escort-based helicopter, principally because of its size. And the Navy persuaded the Treasury Board that this helicopter, suitably modified to carry a tethered sonar, was the answer. The Sea Sprite encountered technical difficulties during its Navy preliminary evaluation, and negotiations for a firm fixed price between Cayman and the Canadian Department of Defense Production revealed that the cost had increased substantially. The upshot was that the Canadian Navy acquired the Sea King for the improved Saint Laurent class destroyer escorts. In all, 41 Sea Kings were acquired. The first 4 were manufactured in the United States, while the remaining 37 were assembled at the United Aircraft of Canada Limited plant in Montreal. The first Canadian Sea King, 4005, was flown on the 27th of August, 1964, and the final aircraft, 4041, was delivered to the Canadian Navy's air station at Shearwater, Nova Scotia on the 3rd of May, 1969. The next part of my presentation deals with the development of an instantaneous securing device, or more formally, the helicopter haul down and rapid securing device commonly referred to as the bear trap. Based on trials conducted before the arrival of the Sea King, it became apparent that the challenge of flight operations from a small boy was not in landing the helicopter on a small deck, but what to do with it once it got there. The aircraft needed to be rapidly secured on deck with a minimum of personnel involved. Equally importantly, the helicopter had to be moved safely from the flight deck to the security of the hangar. The concept that emerged was a set of opposing beams inside an approximately 3-foot square frame that would lock around a probe on the aircraft to immediately secure it to the flight deck. Once the aircraft was shut down, it would be centered inside the frame and then traversed into the hangar without the requirement to manhandle the aircraft on deck. Reflecting on the concept several years later, Commander John Frank, the Director of Aircraft Design and Development in Canadian Naval Headquarters, noted that there were many skeptics, not only within the Royal Canadian Navy, but also in the United States Navy, the British Royal Navy, the helicopter industry, and even in the Canadian Treasury Board. Trials of the bear trap system commenced in Assiniboine in 1963 and took more than 3 years to complete. With the completion of night flying and heavy weather trials, the system was cleared for day and night operations to 30 degrees of roll and 9 degrees of pitch. The final ship was eventually declared fully operational in November '68. This ends the fleet introduction phase of my presentation. We must now move quickly through the Cold War years of the 70s and the 80s to the 1st of August, 1990. The Sea Kings at Shearwater were busy preparing for a fall NATO exercise, but on the 2nd of August, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Sea King saga took a dramatic turn. In fact, the preparation of the Sea Kings for Op Friction, the Canadian response to the first Gulf War, and the helicopter's subsequent deployment and operations in the Gulf were, without question, the Canadian Sea King community's finest hour, and set in train a series of events that would dramatically change the role of the Sea King from an anti-submarine helicopter to a surface surveillance platform. The timeline for the deployment for Op Friction is shown here. And just to make the point, it was 2 weeks to the day that 5 modified Sea King helicopters embarked in the 2 ships that sailed. In 2 short weeks, the dipping sonar was removed and the following items were installed, including a light machine gun. Here are the accomplishments for the 5 embarked aircraft deployed during Op Friction. Yes, that works out to an average of 500 hours per airframe, and in-theater periodic inspections using emergency maintenance procedures had to be carried out for the first time on Canadian aircraft. While I'd love to dwell on Op Friction, we have nearly 30 years to go. So fast forward to 1992 and another seminal deployment. In this case, the deployment was to Somalia for Op Deliverance. During this operation, the Sea King spent more time over land than over sea, and it was suggested that the aircraft's name should be changed from Sea Kings to Sand Kings. Preserver and her 3 assigned helicopters left Halifax on 16 November, and on the 5th of December, as they were approaching their destination, the ship was informed that her mission was changed and that she was now to be part of the US-led coalition forces in Somalia and would support a Canadian Joint Force headquarters staff as well as a Canadian battle group ashore as part of Op Deliverance. The ship arrived off Mogadishu on the 13th of December. The helicopters were pressed into service immediately, with their primary task being to sling supplies to the Canadian Battle Group deployment area, an airfield near the town of Baledogli, about 55 kilometers to the northwest of Mogadishu. The Battle Group was later relocated to Belatwain, nearly 400 kilometers inland. When the Battle Group carried out their road move, the Sea Kings provided overhead recce for the 2-day deployment. Displaying great flexibility, the air detachment then switched to a new mission, that of overland reconnaissance for the Canadian Battle Group. These flights were of incredibly long duration and required refueling in Belatwain on both the outbound and return legs from the ship. The forward-looking infrared camera with its video replay capability was key to this task. When it was discovered that the Sea Kings were the only aircraft with this equipment in theater, they were in high demand to conduct nightly reconnaissance sorties for the coalition forces and were airborne nearly every night during the month of February 1993. In addition to their reconnaissance efforts, the Sea Kings also carried out medical evacuations, and the crews completed so many of these that the senior US Navy medical officer affectionately called them the body snatchers. All in all, this deployment was highly successful for both Preserver and her air detachment. The Sea Kings, the maintainers, and the aircrew had demonstrated yet again their inherent flexibility. We'll now move on to the year 2010. This was a truly exceptional year, even by Sea King standards. Virtually every mission, foreign and domestic, was conducted, and significant progress was made in preparation for the acceptance of the Sikorsky Cyclone, Canada's new maritime helicopter. The year 2010 began at sea with Fredericton conducting patrols in the internationally recognized transit corridor for counter-piracy operations in the Horn of Africa. Following this, Fredericton carried out a port visit to Dubai in mid-February. While there, an aircraft exchange was carried out by a Royal Canadian Air Force C-17. Fredericton's new Sea King performed well, and after conducting operations in the Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, she headed home on the 8th of April to arrive in Halifax on the 4th of May. Back in the Western Hemisphere on the 12th of January, a devastating earthquake struck Haiti. HMCS Athabascan and her helicopter deployed from Halifax 36 hours later on the 14th of January in order to provide disaster relief as part of Op Hestia. In this operation, Athabascan Sea King once again demonstrated its inherent flexibility. Initial flights were spent in conducting an area recce, and then the heavy lifting began. The Canadian Disaster Assistance Response Team and its equipment were moved from Port-au-Prince Airport to Jacmel, and the Royal 22nd Regiment from Jacmel to Léogâne. Next, it was slinging fresh water in 750-liter containers called rhinos from the ships to depots ashore. All in all, Athabascan Sea King moved 597 personnel and nearly 10 tons of equipment and supplies to assist the people of Haiti. At the same time as Sea Kings were involved in operations in the Arabian Gulf and the Caribbean, they were also involved in Op Podium in support of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police-led Integrated Security Unit during the 2010 Vancouver Olympic and Paralympic Games on Canada's West Coast. The Sea King proved to be the most versatile of the assigned aircraft and carried out the widest variety of tasks. Daily missions were divided between the Maritime Component Commander, who required daily surveillance of the approaches to Vancouver through dawn and dusk patrols, and the Air Component Commander, who would task the Sea Kings for personnel transfers, logistic runs, and RCMP support. Happily, the games went smoothly, and the Sea Kings returned home without incident. We returned to the east coast of Canada, where HMCS Montreal carried out ship helicopter operating limits trials for the Cyclone helicopter, using the same techniques and procedures developed by VX-10, the Canadian Navy's experimental squadron, nearly 50 years before. The next major activity took place in Ontario from the 16th to the 30th of June, where the Sea Kings participated in Op Cadence, Canadian Armed Forces support to the RCMP-led Integrated Security Unit for the G8 and G20 summit meetings in Huntsville, Ontario, and Toronto. For this op, the Sea Kings were formed as a rotary wing air intercept detachment under NORAD control to respond to low, slow aircraft operating in the restricted zones surrounding the summit sites. I had always maintained that the Sea King could perform every mission except combat air patrol. I was clearly mistaken. While the Sea Kings were standing guard over the summits, HMC ships Calgary and Algonquin departed Esquimalt on the 14th of June for exercise RIMPAC 2010. Calgary returned home on the 30th of July, while Algonquin continued on a south ploy to South America, in which she was joined by Vancouver. Both ships returned home on the 18th of October. The Navy celebrated its centennial year in 2010, with the high point being international fleet reviews on both coasts. Sea Kings provided aerial salutes to both events. The West Coast Review was held on the 12th of June in the presence of the Governor General. And I should point out that that aerial display team you see here is the Canadian Snowbirds and not the Canadian Sea King Air Display Team. The East Coast held their fleet review in Halifax on the 29th of June in the presence of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Next, Toronto sailed from Halifax for Operation Caribe, a counter-drug operation in the Caribbean basin from the 7th of September to the 20th of October. On the 21st of September, Hurricane Igor struck Newfoundland, and 3 Sea Kings were promptly deployed to Gander to provide humanitarian assistance to outlying communities cut off by the hurricane and to carry out damage assessment. All of this activity in 2010 took place, of course, against the backdrop of ongoing requirements for aircrew and maintenance training, search and rescue standby, coastal patrols, and of course, heavy maintenance. Looking back on 2010, it is hard not to share the assessment of the 423 Squadron Air Maintenance Officer, who stated that experiencing firsthand the year 2010, one may be predisposed to believe it to be an atypical year. But there were few atypical years in the Canadian Sea King saga. And so life continued for the remaining years of the Canadian Seeking Service. Nothing quite like the pace of 2010, but the added complication was that preparations were underway for the introduction of the Sikorsky Cyclone, Canada's new maritime helicopter. It was decided that there would be no operational pause to allow for a gradual transition from the Seeking to the Cyclone. And I'm certain that you are all aware of the challenges that this would present. Finally, on Saturday, the 1st of December, 2018, the Royal Canadian Air Force's venerable Seeking helicopters made their last flypast over their hangar in Patricia Bay, British Columbia. As the pipes and drums struck up Old Lang Syne, there was nary a dry eye in the audience, which was made up of those that had supported, maintained, and flown the Seeking for 55 years. A fitting tribute to an aircraft that has served Canada and Canadians well. And I should point out, this photo was taken a couple of days before the last flypast. And the second aircraft in this pair, 12417, had just returned from fighting forest fires in the interior of British Columbia. Perseverance indeed, and well done, Seekings. That concludes my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Colonel Orr. Great presentation, great aircraft. I basically, again, I flew this aircraft when I was in the Navy, and I can tell you that it was the workhorse for the United States also, not just from Canada. And my hat goes off to Sikorsky for providing us with such a great machine that has saved so many lives and have done so much good for the Canadian people and the American people and everybody around the world. So thank you for bringing their story, or the story up to light. There's more to be done on this aircraft, obviously, more to be done as far as the history and researching what it has done. It's amazing how much stuff it's done over land, perhaps more stuff over land than over the water, but you never know.
Oh, no. We did our time over the water too, trust me. But over land is a bit more dramatic.
It is more dramatic. Anyway, I would like to open the floor to questions. I don't see any questions coming over through the question and answer chat here, but we obviously have 5 minutes. I'm going to interrupt my questioning if somebody asks a question. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask you a question while we are waiting for those questions to come through, since we have some time here before the next presenter. So tell me more about your experience. I mean, you're a retired Canadian officer, Navy officer. You and I have interchanged some emails, but we never really interchanged more about your background. How many hours do you have on the aircraft? And if you have any flaw on the aircraft, as far as this is what I didn't like about the Seeking when I was flying it for so many years, I would like to know what that is. If there's anything that you might not have anything, but I just want to know if there's anything you didn't like about the aircraft, of the operations of the aircraft itself.
That's an interesting question. I mean, to go back to your first point, all my tours were operational tours. So I did not have an instructional tour. So my total of flying time is pretty small in comparison to others. I have just over 3,000 hours on the Seeking, and as you pointed out earlier, I did an exchange tour with the U.S. Navy flying the SH-3 helicopters down there. As far as any flaws, it was the robustness of the Seeking that impressed me. And as an air engineer once told me, John, you have to remember that the Seeking was designed using a slide rule, not a computer. And so it had a tremendous reserve capacity. And trust me, in our operations from the flight deck using the bear trap and so on, we use that reserve capacity. And so at the end of the day, I have no complaints. And in fact, I've got a great deal of praise for this helicopter. It was an amazing, it wasn't exactly a sports car, but boy, if you needed it to do a job, and as dirty weather and challenging situations and so on and so forth, you could count on it to pull through. It was really, really an amazing aircraft. And hats off to the technical support, not only from Sikorsky and United Aircraft of Canada Limited, but particularly from our maintainers who kept that thing going. And I think those that know the Sea-King know that it could be cantankerous from time to time, but it was a wonderful machine, extremely robust.
Yeah, no, thank you. The reason why I asked the question is because I never heard anything bad about the aircraft, even when I was in the United States Navy and I talked to the pilots there. It's just a fantastic machine from beginning to end. What a great aircraft, and we thank Sikorsky for that. And speaking of Sikorsky, I have a question from a man who probably has a lot to do with this aircraft, Dr. Kenneth Rosen, chief designer at times at Sikorsky. He has a question for you. He says, can you talk about the operations in the Canadian North, Arctic islands, of icing conditions, anything that had to do with cold weather, bad weather in that type of operations?
Can I modify my previous answer? Yeah, icing was a problem with the Sea-King. We in Canada tried to develop a blade de-icing apparatus and so on, but it really wasn't terribly effective. So if there was icing in the forecast, that was a real problem. We encountered icing. We had difficulty, and we didn't have to go into the Arctic to encounter icing. In fact, Nova Scotia has some pretty good icing conditions offshore here. So it was something we are aware of. We did with the Sea-King, we never designed the capability to be able to regularly fly in icing. However, my understanding is that the Cyclone, the Sikorsky Cyclone, the S-92.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that answer. Any other questions, please? We have about a couple more minutes, but while we wait for another question, I work at Sikorsky Aircraft for about 8 years or so, and I can tell you, I mean, their approach to design is unique. There's a lot of ruggedness involved in on their designs, especially helicopters. So I can see where the helicopter. One of the things we forget about helicopters that operate in the water is the resistance to corrosion, and that's something that you're a Navy man. I am a Navy person also. We are really, we have to pay attention to that very much. Let's see. Your understanding is correct. That Dr. Rosen is saying that your understanding is correct. I just want to pass that on to you.
I just want to say something about this photograph here. You can see the rainbow, and actually there are two rainbows there. I don't know if you can make it out, but I pointed this out to a historian in our Directorate of History and Heritage, and he came back right away. He said, "Well, what's the problem? I mean, why are you so excited about this image with the rainbows and so on?" He said, "I thought the Sea-King was an all-weather aircraft."
That's funny. That's right. It was an all-weather aircraft indeed. That's for sure. So you got to see the stuff that I saw in Nimitz flying off the carriers. It was. Sometimes I wonder if those guys were really sane. They probably were insane, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so we are done with your presentation, Colonel Orr. If you'd be so kind to turn off your camera, I'm going to present the next presenter. And again, thank you so much.